I am Shaun Abreu, candidate to be your next city council member for Council District 7 to succeed my good friend here, Mike Levine. I am also here before us today with our Congressman Ritchie Torres and residents of Grand Houses. We have Ms. Johnson and we have Callie here. We are here to bring attention to the fact that there's a big issue with public housing. We know that folks are living in mold, vermin, lead. Elevators are dysfunctional. We're witnessing an infrastructure problem for generations we have seen for so long. And tenants here have had to endure the impacts of the lack of repairs that have really sunk NYCHA for so many years. But most importantly, we are here to bring attention to the fact that in our federal Congress, Congressman Ritchie Torres is fighting to make sure that we're bringing public housing and including that as part of the infrastructure bill that Biden is putting forward. En breve, en español, yo soy Shaun Abreu, soy abogado de inquilino y me postulo a ser el próximo concejal de este vecindario para seguir el paso de nuestro gran amigo concejal Mike Levine. Estamos aquí para traerle atención de las necesidades de la infraestructura de la vivienda pública. Hay una legislación en nivel federal que el congresista Ritchie Torres está empujando que incluiría un 70 billones de dólares de parte de la legislación de infraestructura, que pienso que es muy importante. Pero primeramente vamos a escuchar de los residentes que están aquí para que ellos hablen sobre los problemas de vivienda. Most importantly, let's give the floor to our residents here who can speak about the issues of public housing.
Hi, good morning. My name is Callie Moore. I live in Grand Houses, apartment 4J. I have an issue in my apartment where I have leaks in my living room, overhead of my furniture. It's been like that for 2 years. I don't have anyone to come out to look at it. They told me I needed a contractor for the work, but the work has not been done yet. As far as the bathroom in my apartment, the painters came by, they did the painting, they took the shower rod down, they didn't replace the shower rod. No one should have to live in this kind of condition. The condition of the building is horrible. The elevators constantly stay broken. The people put the garbages all on in the hallway, rats and roaches, mice, whatever you want to name it, piss feeders and everything through the building is unacceptable. So this is all I have to say. I live in 1295 Grand Houses, Ms. Moore.
Thank you, Ms. Moore.
First name spelled C-A-L-L-I-E, Moore, M-O-O-R-E.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. All right, Ms. Johnson.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Maureen Johnson. I live in 1305. There is a problem with the rats. There's a problem with the infrastructure. There's a problem with the lighting under the canopy. I've come home a couple of nights and the lights weren't on. I'm a woman alone. I have a cane. I have a thing, and I'm very afraid. The elevators don't work all the time. Every weekend we have one elevator that's never working. We have one elevator that's halfway working. We have hot water issues that the water gets cut off. We don't even know. We don't know that the water is cold until we turn it on. The heat, forget about the heat. We don't get the heat at all. We get the heat whenever they want to send it to us, they give it to us. So I have problem with that. I also have problem with the exit doors. I've been trying to tell them to put the glass in the doors and to have the fire doors properly secure, and nobody seems to hear me at all. So we have a lot of infrastructure problems, security. We need security all the time because we're dealing with a lot of people that we don't even know. There's many times I've come home in my lobby, there's been people in my lobby I don't even know. And I'm scared to get on the elevator with them because I don't know who they are. So there's a lot of problems in this project, and I live in 1305, which is the middle building, and we have a lot of different situations there that we really need addressed ASAP right now. All right?
Thank you.
That's all I have to say. My first name is M-A-U-R-E-E-N. Johnson is J-O-H-N-S-O-N. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Ms. Moore and Ms. Johnson for their courage. Le quiero dar la gracia a la señora Ms. Moore y la señora Johnson por tener coraje de brindar su historia de lo que está sucediendo en la vivienda pública. Sabemos que las condiciones de housing se tienen que mejorar. No es justo que una familia no puede entrar en su edificio y no tiene un elevador funcionando. De un edificio que tiene de más de 15 pisos, una persona, una señora anciana que no puede subir en su apartamento porque el elevador no está funcionando, yo pienso que no es justo. Una familia que tenga un hoyo en su ceiling y el agua bajando del ceiling cada vez que está orinando afuera, es un problema. Y por eso que estamos aquí, para traerle atención a esos problemas, pero para asegurar que podemos obtener resultados, que tanto lo necesitamos. Ahora en breve vamos a escuchar, no tiene que ser en breve, a nuestro concejal Mike Levine, que está haciendo un trabajo al nivel de la ciudad de Nueva York y se postula a ser el próximo presidente del condado de Manhattan, y claro que lo estoy apoyando para eso.
Thank you so much, Shaun. A true rising star here in Uptown politics. You're proving it again today. Thank you for bringing us together. And my goodness, it's always an honor to stand next to my dear friend and colleague, former colleague, Ritchie Torres. I can't call him a rising star because he's already risen.
And I'm
but
old.
in a few short months in Congress, Ritchie has already emerged as one of the most essential voices nationally on public housing and many other issues. And I sleep better at night knowing Ritchie's down there fighting for public housing, fighting for New York City in Congress. And I'm also very grateful to our neighbors here. Ms. Moore, Ms. Johnson, thank you for speaking out and sharing your stories today. This is a story of epic failure by this city, which has broken the moral compact with residents, Ms. Moore, Ms. Johnson, residents of Grand Houses and throughout the city, to provide safe, decent, affordable housing. And there's a lot of blame to go around, but there's ultimately no avoiding the fact that there are $40 billion of unmet capital needs in our public housing system. And that is why you see failures in elevators, in plumbing, in lighting, in doors. Virtually every system in our public housing is in desperate need of investment. Here in Grand Houses alone, the estimated price tag to bring the systems up to code is $350 million in one development. Wow. One development. We have a chance now to undo the federal neglect that has led to this underinvestment. Since the Reagan era, the federal government has reneged on its obligation to support the public housing system that it helped create. We have a chance now, thanks to Democratic control of the White House, both houses of Congress, we have a chance now in the infrastructure bill to right this wrong. But I want to thank Congressman Torres for saying very clearly that the amount of money in this federal stimulus package for public housing is wholly insufficient. The current amount in the bill, I think, is it 30 billion? 40 billion? The current amount in the bill, 40 billion for the entire country, is equivalent to the need in New York City alone. And I want to add my support to Congressman Torres, who is standing up and saying that is unacceptable. We need to seize this moment. We may never have this again. We need to seize this moment to do right by public housing, to do right by Grand Houses, to do right by Ms. Moore and Ms. Johnson, to finally pay the moral debt that we owe to these residents. Probablemente en español. Hoy se trata de hablar de un fracaso, el fracaso de la ciudad de Nueva York, que durante años ha fallado en lo que debe a los residentes, tales como estas dos doñas aquí, las señoras Moore y Johnson, que viven en condiciones que nadie quisiera que ningún ser querido viviera. Con plomería que no funciona, elevadores que no funcionan, luces que se van, inundaciones a cada rato, ratones y ratas. Es inaceptable y es debido a un fracaso a nivel federal más que nada, donde las inversiones han sido recortadas durante décadas. Gracias a Dios tenemos un campeón, como lo cual es el congresista Ritchie Torres, que está luchando por una inversión en el próximo proyecto de ley de infraestructura que sería equivalente a lo que se necesita acá en Grand Houses y a través de nuestro sistema de vivienda pública en Nueva York. Así que me uno al futuro concejal, todavía no congresista, Shaun. Me uno al futuro concejal Shaun Abreu con el actual congresista Ritchie Torres a exigir la inversión que debería de haber acá en Grand Houses y en NYCHA. Thank you very much.
All right, and here we have our star, Ritchie Torres. Ritchie Torres has been a darling of public housing. He grew up in living under lead, mold, and vermin. He's someone who cares deeply about public housing residents. When he was elected, the first thing that came to mind is that Ritchie's going to be fighting for the Bronx. He's going to be fighting for the Bronx to make sure that his family's experiences and what he went through, that no other family would have to go through that again. El congresista Ritchie Torres se crió en condiciones de vivienda pública, donde hubo mojo, las paredes no la estaban pintando, se crió en un vecindario que necesitaba la ayuda. Y cuando Ritchie ganó el Congreso, yo sabía que él iba a ser un peleador para el distrito del Bronx, pero para la ciudad de Nueva York. He's going to be a fighter for public housing everywhere in the state, in New York State, especially for the city of New York. And so it's a huge honor to consider Ritchie not only a great friend, but someone who I can count on to have the best interests of our families at the forefront.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. It is an honor to be here. Oh, whoa. My outline. There you go. It is an honor to be here with one of the greatest public health leaders I know, Mike Levine, who has been rightly referred to as the Dr. Fauci of New York City, and one of the greatest housing advocates I know, Shaun Abreu. And we're here to speak about the subject of public housing, which lies at the intersection of both health and housing. And I want to thank Shaun for mobilizing policymakers and tenants to shine a spotlight on the humanitarian crisis in public housing. Preserving public housing is not simply a matter of public policy for me. It's deeply personal. I would not be in the United States Congress were it not for public housing and the stability it gave me and my family. NYCHA is the largest provider of affordable housing, not only in our city, but across the country. It's a safety net for our senior citizens, to whom all of us owe a debt. It's a safety net for our essential workers, on whom all of us depend, especially during COVID-19. The greatest solution to homelessness is housing. And there's no greater solution to homelessness here in New York City than public housing. There are 50,000 people in our shelter system. If public housing were to vanish tomorrow, there would be hundreds of thousands of people overflowing our municipal shelter system. Public housing prevents homelessness on a catastrophic scale. And even though public housing is too big to fail, for far too long it has been set up to fail. As Mark has said, public housing has been so savagely starved of funding that it has a capital need of $40 billion and counting. And that number is not abstract, it has a human cost. And the people who pay that cost are the residents behind me. There are senior citizens who during the cold of winter are freezing in their homes because of the federal government. There are children who have been poisoned by lead, who will never be the same again because of the federal government. There are disabled residents who are stranded in their top floor apartments with their elevators breaking down because of the federal government. There are asthmatics who are struggling to breathe in the face of molded and leaking conditions because of the federal government. As a kid, I was in 3 places most of the time. I was at home, I was at school, and I was in the emergency room because I was repeatedly hospitalized for asthma. And that is the typical experience of children in public housing. And so we have to ensure that public housing gets its fair share of federal funding. President Biden is proposing $40 billion for public housing nationwide. But NYCHA alone has a $40 billion capital need. We need to ensure that the New York City Housing Authority at least gets $40 billion and that public housing nationwide gets at least $70 billion so that we can finally confront the humanitarian crisis unfolding in public housing. I want to thank Shaun for his leadership. There is no one who's going to fight more vigorously for housing as a human right, for housing as infrastructure, than Shaun Abreu. He is an American success story, right? He went to Columbia University. He came from humble origins, but rose to Columbia University. But after graduating from Columbia, he could have chosen a lucrative career, which is what most people would have done in his position. But instead, he chose public service, which is encoded in his DNA. He chose to return home as a public servant and as a tenant attorney who protects people from eviction, who protects tenants from disrepair in their homes. You know, my friend Shaun embodies the most important lesson in life, which is to never forget who you are and never forget where you come from. And with people like Shaun in public service, the people of Northern Manhattan, indeed the people of New York City, will never be forgotten. So watch Shaun, stay tuned, because he represents the next generation of public service when Mark and I have long retired. A few words in Spanish. My Spanish, for the record, is not as good as Mike Levine or Shaun Abreu.
Sure, you do great.
Soy el Congresista Ritchie Torres. Históricamente, el gobierno federal ha abandonado a la vivienda pública. Un presidente demócrata y un Congreso demócrata significan una oportunidad para cambiar el curso de la historia. Las condiciones de vida en la vivienda pública representan una crisis humanitaria. En la ciudad de Nueva York, la vivienda pública necesita 40 millones de fondos federales. Estamos aquí para comunicar un mensaje sencillo. La vivienda es infraestructura. La vivienda es un derecho humano. El futuro concejal Shaun Abreu luchará por todos los inquilinos. Él es un defensor de los inquilinos, siempre lo ha sido y siempre lo será.
Wow. Wow. My brother, I love you, man. Well, thank you for that, Ritchie Torres, Congressman Ritchie Torres, and Mike Levine. You know, we're here. I'm happy to take any questions.
I think you reported as saying that the $40 billion represents an end to the grip of austerity politics. Republicans are supposed to be meeting with President Biden today to talk about his infrastructure plan. And of course, what they've been saying publicly is that they want to narrow the scope. So there's a chance that they want to water down to $40 billion. How concerning is that you get the $7 billion?
Look, I am cautiously optimistic. You know, we're living through the makings of an FDR moment. You know, a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. And we have to recognize that we have to govern as boldly in the 21st century as FDR did in the 20th century. But I hope for the best, but we have to prepare for the worst. We have to operate as though we're going to lose the majority in 2022. And so it's critical that we get as much for infrastructure in general and public housing in particular, as much funding as possible. So I would argue that the package is not too big, it's too small. I think the bigger and bolder, the better. And public housing has been plagued by decades of disinvestment. This is the best opportunity that we have to finally address the humanitarian crisis in public housing. And if we let this opportunity slip us by, then the residents of public housing are going to pay a dear price. And there's no telling when we're going to have an FDR moment again.
I have two questions. The first one, people don't trust that it will happen. You know, they know you're speaking out. There's
it's a new day in Washington, D.C. You know, we have a Democratic president who just passed the American Rescue Plan, which is a $1.9 trillion investment. Like, we expanded the child tax credit, cutting child poverty in half. We've sent $1,400 stimulus checks to family in need. Never has the federal government been more responsive to the needs of working people than it is now. So it's a new day. We're living through a historic moment, and I am as optimistic as I've ever been about the prospects for a historic reinvestment in public housing.
And there is a sense of urgency. I mean, a few years ago, the governor, I think it was a few years ago, and he labeled it an emergency, a state emergency. So where is the sense of urgency going?
I mean, I can tell you I feel a deep sense of urgency, and I've spoken to the Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who assures me that he's going to secure at least $70 million in funding for public housing. I mean, we're optimistic. We're going to fight for it. You know, both Chuck Schumer and the Chair of Financial Services, Maxine Waters, are deeply committed to securing more funding for public housing. It's my highest priority. You know, Shaun is mobilizing us because it's a priority for him. It's a priority for the Anthony Fauci of New York City. But we're taking nothing for granted. That's why we're here fighting. That's why Shaun felt it was important to mobilize all of us, because we have to shine a spotlight.
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
Public-private partnership. A lot of residents have been reaching out to us. They're very fearful about this public-private partnership coming in. Would that override that? Like, there's a lot of agreements in place to get real estate companies to take over. What would happen if you do get fully funded? Would those real estate agreements still continue, or what would happen to that?
I mean, you're referring to, look, I reject the notion that there's going to be a real estate takeover of public housing. I think every elected official is committed to preserving public housing as a public good. But if your question is about RAD, if we're able to secure funding for traditional public housing, then there's less of a need for RAD conversions.
Wow. I mean, that's a big deal to say that,
Yeah.
to be able to say
Well,
that.
well, in a world without funding for public housing, RAD is the only tool you have for preserving public housing. But if traditional public housing is receiving funding directly from the federal government, then there's less of a need for RAD. Absolutely.
But if you want to, I don't know if you had a question for me, but
Direct message to President Biden and to his administration, if he's watching, about the question whether or not public housing is infrastructure. There's a lot of people who say, look, public housing may not be infrastructure. What say you?
yeah, when we think about infrastructure, we think about bridges and roads. But it's time to expand that definition to include public housing and also, you know, transportation. The public housing, tell me what's not infrastructure about an elevator. Tell me what's not infrastructure about an apartment or a ceiling that has a hole or the pipes that need to be replaced. Tell me what's not infrastructure about that. It's clearly infrastructure, and that's why we are here, to make a call to our president that we need more funding for public housing. As our council member said, and as our congressman said, $40 billion is not enough. It's only enough to even just cover New York, much less for the entire country. And so here, as fiduciaries to New York City, we want to make sure that we're delivering public housing funds at a great level to address the needs and restore the conditions of our housing. So thank you for the question.
And quick question to you about health. Is this a health emergency? Do you consider this a public
Absolutely.
Public housing, is it a public health crisis/hazard?
It is undeniably a health crisis because of lead poisoning, because of mold causing asthma, because of people who are frigid in unheated apartments in the winter. This is a population which has many seniors who are vulnerable in these conditions. There's a direct impact on the health of New Yorkers when we underinvest in public housing. And yes, this is infrastructure, as Shaun said. Infrastructure is the underlying assets that make it possible for society to function, for people to move, for people to communicate, for people to live in healthy housing. And so this is a proper investment in this infrastructure bill. It will allow people to live in dignity, and it will undeniably be a public health win for the hundreds of thousands of residents who could see their lives changed by the scale of investment that the Congress member is fighting for in Washington.
My final question, just a time frame, timeline. What can you tell people living in
I think we're hoping to pass the American Jobs Plan by July, and we're going to attempt to secure at least $70 billion for public housing. But I'm in the federal government. All we can do is allocate the money. But as you know, money is only as good as how well it's spent, and that's why we're going to count on leaders like Shaun to hold NYCHA accountable for spending those dollars properly. So my job is the easy part. It's the allocating the money. He actually has to hold NYCHA accountable for spending these dollars properly, and that's why the City Council has a critical role to play.
Hola, ¿cómo estamos?
Hola, ¿cómo te sientes? Shaun, ¿cuál es el compromiso que tú asumes de convertirte en concejal para enfrentar esta situación?
Primeramente, tenemos que ganar, porque los recursos que nos darían como consejo municipal, vamos a tener recursos a dirigir cómo los fondos se están gastando para asegurar que mejoremos las condiciones de vivienda. Estamos viendo el nivel histórico que tanto necesitamos. Los elevados no están operando como deben. Las paredes tienen hoyos y hay liqueo de agua. Es un problema grave y necesitamos liderazgo nuevo, liderazgo fresco, que entienda las necesidades de este vecindario. Como le dije, yo cuando era niño mis padres son desalojados y ahora yo soy el abogado de inquilinos peleando para los inquilinos. Yo entiendo la importancia de teniendo un hogar y quedándose en su hogar. Y estas familias, cuando están viviendo en esta crisis pública, yo pienso que se tienen que mudar, y eso no es justo porque ellos no tienen los recursos de mudarse.
¿Cómo te sientes con el apoyo que has recibido de esta gente en el día de hoy?
Me siento muy agradecido, porque yo pienso que estas son las personas que en verdad entienden las necesidades de nuestras comunidades, y teniendo el aporte de nuestra comunidad significa todo, porque un oficial electo no oficial electo sin el aporte de los vecinos.
Dime, ¿cómo va la campaña el día de hoy?
La campaña no va muy bien, estamos comenzando la semana, ayudando a nuestra gente, y vamos a seguir dándole fuerte afuera.
¿Piensa que te proyecta en que va a dar una pela aquí el 22 de junio?
Pienso que vamos por un buen camino. Una pela, no voy a hablar de eso, pero siento que vamos por un buen camino. Tenemos el apoyo del congresista el concejal Mike Levine, que se refieren a él, el Anthony Fauci de la ciudad de Nueva York. Tenemos respaldo del congresista Ritchie Torres, que está haciendo un gran trabajo a nivel federal. Y el apoyo de los líderes comunitarios, desde Manhattan Valley hasta West Harlem, Hamilton Heights y Washington Heights. Tenemos una coalición muy diversa, y eso es lo que eso requiere para ganar.
Ok, gracias. Ahí
Gracias.
está la pela.
Muy buenos resultados en su campaña, aparte de la problemática de NYCHA que tú has encabezado de forma heroica, denunciando la presencia aquí. ¿Cómo tú vas a complementar esta problemática NYCHA con otros asuntos que están afectando tus inversiones?
¿Cómo así?
Es decir, que se va a combinar NYCHA, la lucha de NYCHA, con la lucha de la delincuencia, con la falta de empleo, con la falta de viviendas asequibles del distrito, y con otra problemática que tiene de salud, que muchos problemas tienen que llevar.
Nos estamos postulando para movilizar nuestra gente para mejorar varios sectores y áreas que necesitan ayuda. Primeramente, necesitamos asegurar que traemos más recursos a nivel federal, pero recursos a nivel de la ciudad también, para mejorar las condiciones de vivienda. Pero eso es solamente una parte. También tenemos que expandir servicios legales gratuitos para las familias que enfrentan desalojo sin el apoyo de un abogado. También tenemos que traer programas después de la escuela para que nuestros niños puedan realizar sus sueños y hacer un próximo abogado o un próximo enfermero. También tenemos que asegurar que tengamos seguridad pública, que eso es muy importante, que nuestra comunidad necesita, pero también tenemos que traer recursos físicos y mentalmente para la ciudad de Nueva York.
A nivel de educación, como he visto,
se crió
esta plataforma ahora de
español se lleva con gente que no importa donde venga,
¿cómo planifica tu trabajo dentro
así que
del Consejo
tiene tremendo curso y
a
tiene
ese nivel? ¿Cómo te manejaría a ese nivel a medida que la pandemia
de Nueva York. El proceso de vacunación, ¿cómo va?
Primeramente, los estudiantes que están trabajando de casa, muchos de ellos ni tienen la tecnología para manejar su
ha mejorado.
Tenemos que traer la tecnología.
Más del 40%.
Segundo, los estudiantes y más los estudiantes de bajo ingreso no tienen Wi-Fi. La ciudad de Nueva York puede ofrecer Wi-Fi gratis para mejorar ese problema. Que un estudiante no podrá estudiar si no tiene los recursos básicos, una computadora o Wi-Fi. También tenemos que traerle a ellos programas después de la escuela para que ellos puedan realizar sus sueños, tener actividades recreacionales. También necesitamos fundar maestros que ayuden a los estudiantes a estudiar en las matemáticas y las ciencias, que muchos estudiantes lo encuentran muy difícil y tenemos que invertir en esos programas.
Y a nivel de empleo de los constituyentes del Distrito 7, ¿qué política o qué planes tienen
para el empleo? Mira, hay muchos apartamentos asequibles se tienen que construir y yo pienso que eso es un nivel de conseguir mucho trabajo. Tenemos que invertir más en las preparaciones para que la gente en este vecindario tenga la oportunidad de hacer ese trabajo.
Gracias.
Gracias, Shaun, te deseamos los mejores éxitos.
Zabala, muchísimas gracias. Yo le puedo mandar el statement.